Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a privilege to be here. I was saddened to hear that Dr. Godfrey could not be here. Would have loved to listen to him. But what it did is give me the opportunity to put on paper thoughts that I've had for a while in teaching church history at our seminary in Kiev, Ukraine. So I'm thankful for the opportunity and forcing me to do that. In some sense, these thoughts, I think, are not fully ripe yet, but that's why I'm here, to also get your comments on them, get your feedback. And sometimes you will notice I will also paint with a very broad brush in order to speed up proceedings. Now this is a well-known copper plate etching by Francois Schillemans of the Synod of Dort. Now, what is also well known is that there was a clear seating plan at this synod. Right here in the middle were the remonstrants themselves, once they were summoned until they were expelled from the synod, I believe on the 14th of January 1619. At the head of the synod was the president, Reverend Bogerman, and the assessors and the secretaries. On the right-hand side, we find the foreign delegates, starting with the British. This was left open. These seats were for the French delegates, but they were prevented by the French king to come. Here at the back we find the Dutch delegates from each of the provinces. Also here, right here at the back, we have the Dutch professors, the theological professors. And then here in this corner, we find 18 somewhat unusual delegates. They were representatives of the States General, the central government of the Republic of the Seven United Provinces of the Netherlands, which existed from 1581 to 1795. 2 representatives from each of 6 of the provinces and 6 representatives from the province of Holland, with their secretary sitting in front. So this is the seating plan, and there you will see the state delegates. What were these government officials doing at a reformed synod? And it's a question with a, I believe, complex answer. One that I will not be able to answer completely, but one that I will try to put in a broader context. Let's first look at the more narrow context of the synod itself. What we should not forget in the first place is that this synod was not called by the churches, although a part of the churches had been calling for this synod for a number of years. But this synod was called by the States General. It was they who convened the synod. It was they who set the agenda in cooperation with the churches. And it was they who invited the foreign delegates, and the invitations were not sent to the churches abroad, but were sent to the rulers abroad. This is the reason why King James I of England was so involved, and this is also how the French king knew about it and could deny the French delegates the right to go. So politically speaking, formally speaking, these government delegates occupied the highest authority at the synod. It is therefore not surprising to hear them say in their own words on the 12th of December 1618 that they presided over the synod. Of course, ecclesiastically, Chairman Bolgermans led the meeting. But formally, politically speaking, the government officials were the highest authority. They lent the necessary political authority and executive power to the decisions of the churches. What was the task of these government delegates? We know about that task from a set of secret instructions dated 6 November 1618, and it's recently been published in a work by Christian Moser, Donald Cinema, and Herman Seldreis. Generally speaking, their task was to promote well-being, peace, and unity in church and society, and to advance the Reformed Christian religion. Now, do not underestimate the importance of this point. To promote well-being, peace, and unity in church and society. We are so used to the separation of state and church, but this separation is from a fairly recent development. For the first 1700 years of our era, religion and church were, in the words of Heinz Schilling, considered central, load-bearing pillars of the entire social order. Accordingly, religious change was also social change. And this was also true for the young Dutch Republic that was still trying to establish itself against the old ruler Spain. But let's be more specific about their tasks. Firstly, they had to keep the States General informed about the developments at the Synod. About once a week they would write a letter, and a few times they would also send a delegation to the States General. Secondly, they were responsible to ensure that the purpose of the Synod, as defined by the States General, was carried out. So they supervised the agenda. They made sure that no points were added. They made sure that all the points that were on the agenda were dealt with in a proper way. And this meant that they sometimes had to play a mediating role between the parties in order to get things done. Thirdly, they had to summon the remonstrants and decide who to summon. And this was difficult because the remonstrants had a completely different view of the Synod. They saw it as a conference between two equal parties, discussing a theological issue, with the state delegates as the arbiters. Furthermore, they supervised the voting. And no synodical documents were allowed to be published without their consent. And finally, they were responsible for the finances, as the States General paid for most of the expenses of the Synod. And it is estimated that the cost of the Synod amounted to about 100,000 guilders. So in conclusion, we can say that they were entrusted with the overall oversight of the Synod. They were the highest authority in non-theological matters. But still, representatives of the civil government seated in a prominent position on the right hand of the president at a reformed synod. How did we get here? Well, if you can, thank you. Let's go back 60 years and just very briefly work our way back to 1618. The first meeting where the Dutch Reformed churches started organizing themselves was in Wesel, 1568. Same year as the start of the Dutch revolt against Spanish reign, and thus the start of the 80 Years' War. Therefore, this meeting had to take place outside of the boundaries of the Netherlands. Now, what's important is that the meeting in Wesel was not a synod. There were no official delegates. but it did set the pattern for what was to follow. The first official synod, 3 years later in Emden, 1571, again outside the borders of the Netherlands, in Germany. And in the new church order that was agreed upon at this synod, Calvin's Geneva was the, let's say, the orientation point in the ecclesial structure that was chosen. Elders and deacons to work with the pastors, and classes and synods as bodies of cooperation between congregations. Many years later, just before the Synod of Dort, the lawyer Hugo Grotius would complain against this very structure of the ecclesiastical government, as it left little room for control by the state. We move on, then we get two synods that were held in Dort, 1574 and 1578. The one in 1574 was, by the way, not a national synod, it was a regional or a provincial synod. Both these synods were held in Dort, in a liberated Netherlands. At these meetings, it was required of the pastors to subscribe to the confessions. Again, this is an important point to see, because this was one of the points against which Arminius and his followers would object. They did not want to subscribe to the confessions. In fact, they wanted to change the confessions. In 1578, it was also decided that synod meetings should be held every 3 years. So not by the approval of the state, but by the agreement of the churches. Now this indeed happened 3 years later, Middelburg, 1581. And here it was also shown how serious the churches were about subscription to the confessions, when they condemned the unorthodox views of Reverend Caspar Colas. And a year later he was excommunicated. Interestingly, the unorthodox views were firstly his view on the relationship between church and state. He was a supporter of Thomas Erastus, which I believe taught here in Heidelberg. And secondly, he did not want to subscribe to the confessions. But here also we see the battle between church and state. Because although he was excommunicated, the city of Leiden continued to pay his pastor's stipend or his pastor's salary for the next 5 years. And then we move to The Hague, 1586. And this synod was particularly important for determining the church's relationship with the civil government. Here they decided that the government should not interfere with the appointment of pastors. Classes were allowed to appoint and dismiss pastors. And furthermore, refusal to subscribe to the confessions would lead to dismissal. So in these first 6 synod meetings, we see a pattern. Subscription to the confessions and ecclesiastical independence from government interference. The young Dutch Reformed churches were clearly trying to establish their identity. However, The Hague, 1586, was the last synod before the last national synod before the Synod of Dort, 1618, 1619. And in these almost 3 decades, between 1586 and 1618, we see an increased involvement of the government in the affairs of the church, especially in the first 2 decades of the 17th century, and particularly in the affair or the debate between the professors of the University of Leiden, Gomarus and Arminius. In fact, parallel to the Gomarus-Arminius debate, it is imperative, I believe, that we see the debate about the church-state relationship that was playing itself out. That we see the remonstrance preference of having the civil government involved in the ecclesiastical affairs. Therefore, they were called the politiken, the politicals. And the contra-remonstrants, reservations against government involvement, they were called the kerkelijken, the ecclesiasticals. And that we also see the growing distance and hostility between two key political role players during this period. Lands advocate Johan van Oldenbarneveld, who was a remonstrant, and on the other hand, Stadtholder Maurice of Orange, the son of William of Orange. If we look at the decades leading up to the Synod of Dort, we see a growing government involvement. And for the sake of the time, I'll mention the few most important moments. Arminius was appointed at the University of Leiden in 1603. And soon the differences between himself and Gomarus came to the fore. After pleading with the States General for a synod to be called together, permission was granted in 1606 for a committee to meet and prepare an agenda. And both Gomarus and Arminius, they participated in this meeting. The states of Holland and Zeeland, as well as Arminius and his associates, wanted the agenda to include the revision of the confessions and the church order. Gomarus and his associates, however, felt that the synod had to judge these matters on the basis of Scripture and the confessions. Now, this meeting to set an agenda was held in 1607, but no agreement could be reached. In 1608, a conference called by the States General, where both Gomarus and Arminius defended their positions, led the states to conclude that the differences between the two professors related to subtle points of doctrine, and that these points could coexist. Therefore, Gomarus and Arminius were implored to tolerate one another. To which Gomarus reacted that he would not be able to appear before God's judgment seat with Arminius' positions. At two separate occasions, late in 1608, Arminius and Gomarus appeared separately before the states to defend their positions. In August 1609, they were again summoned to a conference in The Hague. Arminius had to leave early. He was sick and he passed away shortly afterwards. In 1610, 43 followers of Arminius presented their remonstrance based on Arminius' works and compiled under the leadership of Johannes Uitenborgaert, not to the churches, but to the states of Holland and West Frisia. And they called for a synod and a revision of the confessions. And the states, under the leadership of Johan van Oldenbarneveld, they decided to adopt the remonstrance as a binding document. Instead of settling the matter, this decision caused so much unrest that the states decided to hold a conference with 6 proponents and 6 opponents of the remonstrance. Though this so-called Hague Conference of 1611 did advance the understanding, the knowledge of each other, it did not resolve the differences. In their counter-remonstrance, the Reformed stated that it was not the government, but the church which had the right of decision in matters of doctrine. After this conference, and in order to silence the debate, the states issued an order in 1611 requiring that candidates for the ministry should not be questioned beyond what was stated in the remonstrance. Now, this fact implied that the political leadership chose the side of the remonstrance, and this caused even more unrest. In 1614, the young lawyer Hugo Grotius, after a request by the states, he wrote a resolution for the peace of the churches, in which he states that tolerance is imperative for the health of the churches and the economy. The contra-remonstrants, however, could not keep silent. And in many cases, they were persecuted and they were evicted from their church buildings. On July 23rd, 1617, Prince Maurice of Orange chose to attend a contra-remonstrant church service, thereby openly showing his support for or against the remonstrants. In reaction to this, Van Oldenbarneveld issued the so-called sharp resolution, scherpe resolutie, which allowed the cities to hire troops to settle the unrest. He also refused a national synod. This action by Van Oldenbarneveld was seen as a declaration of independence by the province of Holland and as an act of revolution. And the States General, in reaction, gave Prince Maurice the power to suppress this, and they also decided to convene a synod. Now, in all of this, these 15 years, we see the intense involvement of the civil government in the affairs of the church. State and church, civil and ecclesiastical affairs were so intertwined during these decades that it is sometimes difficult to distinguish them, if that is at all possible. And thus it is no surprise to find these state delegates present when the Synod of Dort started on November the 11th, 1618. So we looked at the narrow context of the Synod. We took it a little bit broader. We went 60 years back. But by your permission, I want to draw the lines even broader. From her very start, the Christian church has had to define and understand her position in relationship to the civil government. For the first 300 years, this was to a large degree decided for her, as she was an often persecuted minority. But with the conversion of Constantine, things changed. Now she grew from a tolerated religion to a privileged religion to a state religion in the Roman Empire. An important moment is when Constantine decides to move his capital from Rome to Byzantium, and he calls it Constantinople in 330. Today, Istanbul. Constantinople, second Rome. Keep that in mind, very important. From that time, the East Roman Empire and the West Roman Empire gradually started growing apart. Different languages, Greek in the East, Latin in the West. Different theologies, theological emphases. Different church-state relationships. And then the final act would be in 1054 with the Great Schism between East and West. What happened in the East in terms of church-state relationship? Now, we often hear the term Caesaropapism, papism, the Caesar being the Pope. I don't think it's a good term. I think it's better to use the Justinian concept of symphonia, symphony. Symphonia draws its origin from the Byzantine political model, and it designates the special relationship between the state and the church, the loyal and mutual cooperation between these two distinctive institutions for the sake of the people who were simultaneously members of the church and citizens of the state. According to John Meyendorff, well-known Eastern Orthodox theologian, the harmony that flows from this symphonia is not a harmony between two powers or two separate civilizations, the church and the state. It is rather intended to represent the internal cohesion of one single human civilization. And this is beautifully symbolized in the official symbol of the Byzantine Empire, that of the double-headed eagle, which represents the church and the state. This vision of the relationship between the church and the state is still predominant, or is still dominant, is still there in countries with a majority Eastern Orthodox population, especially I believe, in Russia. And it's very interesting how this concept of Symphonia has been revived in the post-communist Russia. The Russian coat of arms is also the double-headed eagle. Vladimir Putin's relationship with the Patriarch of Moscow testifies to this relationship. And Russia is often called the Third Rome. So this is the one line, the Eastern Church. The Western Church went a completely different way. Constantine moved his capital to Byzantium, to Constantinople. About 80 years later, Rome fell, 410. 476, the deposition of the last Roman emperor. After that, there was only one significant and stable power left in the West, the Church, through Christ's representative on earth, the Pope. There was no significant political power left in the Western Roman Empire. And when it came, hundreds of years later, with the coming up of Charlemagne in 800, with the coronation of Charlemagne, this only happened with the approval and under the blessing of the Pope. And such was the case with all the Holy Roman Emperors until the coronation of Charles V in 1530. Throughout this period of 1,000 years, the power of the Pope, both ecclesiastically and politically, was undeniable. The Pope even had the geographical territory to prove it. He owned huge chunks of land in Italy, the so-called papal lands. And his claim was strengthened by the so-called donation of Constantine, a document that said that by decree of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire was transferred to the Pope. So the Pope's claim to political authority had imperial backing, even if this document during the Renaissance was proven to be a forgery. And that's why Pope Bonifacius VIII in 1302 could end his famous bull, Unam Sanctam, with the words, "Now therefore we declare, say, determine and pronounce that for every human creature it is necessary for salvation to be subject to the authority of the Roman pontiff." And by the late 15th century, this papal power was depicted beautifully on the walls of the Sistine Chapel by the artist Perugino, with his fresco of Christ handing over the keys to Peter. 2 keys, ecclesiastical power and political power. This was the situation at the end of the 15th century. And then came the Reformation, and it changed everything, because the Reformers put the emphasis on the authority of the Word of God. They did not submit themselves anymore to the authority of the Pope. In many cases, they considered the Pope to be the Antichrist, as we know from the writings of the Reformers. Add to this the fact that the Reformation was, in many cases, aided and realized by the local authorities. It's not for nothing that this period is often called the magisterial Reformation. The ruler of a particular realm often played a decisive role in swinging the confession of that realm one way or the other. And that led, I believe, to the Peace of Augsburg, 1555. And the principle there of cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion. But remember, this only applied to the Holy Roman Empire. And it only included the Roman confession and the Lutheran, the Augsburg confession. And this, I believe, and now we get to an important point, this, I believe, gave rise to what is generally called the period of confessionalization. It's the period from roughly 1560 to 1650, 90 years. And this is exactly the period in which the Synod of Dort takes place. Now, what did confessionalization mean in terms of the state-church relationship? As the medieval Corpus Christianum fell apart and separate nation-states slowly started forming, state and church in many, if not most countries in Europe, formed an alliance in which both needed the other and both supported each other. And these were in some cases official state churches, in other cases privileged churches. But it always meant that a specific confession, whether Roman, Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed or Anglican, was privileged over others in a specific realm. And what you got was a kind of redevelopment of the medieval idea of Christendom, but now implemented at a regional or a national rather than a continental level. Each region was a mini Christendom governed by its own particular understanding of what Christianity actually was. You got a kind of territorial religion based on an authorized declaration of doctrines, confessions, which would be binding on all subjects and enforced by an established church which was accountable to the prince or the magistrates. In cooperation with the early modern state, these confessional churches, each in its own way, set about purifying, standardizing, and unifying religious life in its territory. Now, this is exactly the situation we have during the Synod of Dort. We have a young Dutch republic, barely a few decades old. We have a republic at war with its former overlords, the 80 Years' War with Spain, although interestingly the Synod of Dort took place exactly during a 12 years truce. And we have a privileged church, the Reformed Church, built on the teaching of Scripture and of the confessions, the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgian Confession. And then you get two professors, and they get into a debate about predestination, a seemingly theological issue, something to be settled inside the walls of the classrooms of the university. But as this theological issue escalates and becomes an existential issue for all layers of society, because that is what it was, it becomes imperative for the States General that it is settled in the best possible way. It is imperative for the social and religious harmony within this young Dutch republic that a solution is found. And that's how we end up with 18 odd state delegates at the Synod of Dort starting on the 13th of November 1618. During this conference we will hear much about the theological issues, and rightly so. But I think parallel to this we should keep in mind the debate about the church-state relationship. And in a sense that is true for the whole of church history. Now to end off, how then should we view this state of affairs at the Synod of Dort? Now for many Reformed Christians today, the presence of the civil government at the Synod of Dort would be the only shadow in an otherwise glorious victory of orthodoxy over heresy. The only dissonance in this monument in church history. From the perspective of a separation of church and state as we are used to, this reaction is completely understandable. But is it this simple? On October 25, 1543, John Calvin received a letter from Martin Bucer, in which he was requested to provide the upcoming Diet of Speyer with a clear explanation of the state of affairs between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Calvin obliged. And the result was his Supplex Exhortatio ad Caesarem. In this writing he calls upon the Emperor, Charles V, and the princes to seriously take up the restoration of the church. This, according to Calvin, is not merely a personal call, But it should be viewed as the united voice of all who either have already taken care to restore the church or are desirous that it should be restored to true order. Whether the emperor ever read this, we don't know. But the Diet nevertheless produced a positive result for the German Protestants. On June 10th, 1544, Charles V promised that he would convene a general and a free council. As soon as the Pope, Paul III, became aware of this imperial promise, he addressed a paternal admonition to Charles V, dated 1544. In this writing, the Pope admonishes the emperor for promising the Protestants a council without his permission. He reminds Charles that in the ecclesiastical sphere, the emperor's role is that of the arm and not the head. In his biography of Calvin, Beza comments, quote, Pope Paul III, feeling very indignant at such a proceeding, published a very grave admonition to Charles for his having thus placed the heretics on a level with the Catholics, and for putting his scythe into a crop which belonged to another. The emperor, however, was given the assurance by the Pope that a general council is certainly part of the Pope's plans. Now, this paternal admonition by the Pope became known, became public. And Calvin took up the pen and he wrote a reaction. And in his tract, he shows that the Pope's claims are baseless. In history, it has not been the popes, but rather the emperors who assembled councils. For the Pope to make such a claim, he would have to abolish all acts of councils and all ancient history. In addition, it has always been regarded as the right of Christian princes to remove the corruptions of the church and restore it to its proper state. Calvin ends by calling on the emperor to keep his word, to convene a council. And what we see Calvin doing here is what the reformers did so often. They reach back across the Middle Ages to the early church, the age of the ecumenical councils, to show that in that time the emperors were the ones who assembled the councils. Denying this would implicate the denial of the outcomes of these councils, he says. And it takes us back to the early councils, of which the first and probably most well-known one was, of course, the Council of Nicaea, 325. And if you go back to the father of church history, Eusebius of Caesarea, and read what he writes about it, and particularly about the emperor's role in it. In his Life of Constantine, Eusebius describes the Council of Nicaea as another Pentecost, and Constantine as the 13th apostle. This is how highly he valued the role of Constantine in the history of the church at that particular stage. That's true. Calvin was not nearly as lyrical about the emperors as Eusebius was. But clearly he ascribed to them an important task in the reformation of the church and in calling together synods and councils. And something similar we see in that other reformed document that we have, the Belgic Confession, Article 36. I quote one part from it. Their task, the civil government's task of restraining and sustaining is not limited to the public order, but includes the protection of the church and its ministry in order that all idolatry and false worship may be removed and prevented, the kingdom of Antichrist may be destroyed, the kingdom of Christ may come, the word of the gospel may be preached everywhere, and God may be honored and served by everyone as he requires in his words. Now, there's been much discussion about some of these words. Some of these words have been removed from the confession. But we have to acknowledge that our Reformed forefathers clearly saw a task for the civil authorities in creating the external circumstances for the church to preach the word. And therefore we should view it at the very least as God's providence that the States General in the Netherlands convened the Synod of Dort and sent their delegates to ensure that everything was done in good order. And with some hotheads at the Synod, their presence might well have been a blessing in disguise. I thank you.